How about now? Yes, can you hear me now? Okay, good, good, good. So, can someone of you speak so that I know if I am audible or not? Can you hear me? Kunal Juti?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So, the idea of disaster management is basically so whenever disaster or a hazard strikes, and then people lose their ability to how to say cope with this problem, and it crosses the life in an adverse way, then a disaster is born. Actually, the moment the disaster is born, mm, just a moment. We can talk about managing this disaster. So the chief goal of disaster management is basically to save lives, save lives as well as save the properties. So for that, there is steps or kind of four steps usually taken, as you can see it on the screen. First, it starts with the mitigation, then preparedness, response, and recovery. But before that, we have to discuss a little bit about the United Nations Convention on Disaster, or what is the disaster risk reduction. So, disaster risk reduction or disaster risk management is actually the policy objective of disaster management or disaster risk management, and its goals and objectives are defined actually in disaster reduction strategies and plans defined by UNDRR or even ISDR, which was called earlier. So UNDRR, that is the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction. So whenever we talk about disaster management or DRM, actually, it is the application of disaster risk reduction policies, okay, and strategies, whatever are there at place to prevent new disasters and risk, or reduce the existing disaster risk and manage residual risks. So there are sometimes we have residual risks whenever a disaster is gone, the risk is still there remains. That contributes to the strengthening of resilience and reduction of losses. So, or in other way, you can say disaster risk management actions can be categorized into prospective disaster risk management, corrective disaster risk management, and compensatory disaster risk management, which is also known as residual risk. So, before we actually focus on disaster risk management or extreme events that relates during and after the disaster, only through risk analysis. DRM is also an instrument for reducing the risk for disaster preliminary, okay, or primarily by reduction of either vulnerability, or you can say by either reduction of the hazard. So basically, United Nations has some policies at place, and then the United Nations and disaster risk reduction It starts since 1990s. The United Nations has been promoting the efforts to change whatever the paradigm is of now for disasters, that advocates for incorporation of disaster risk reduction efforts worldwide as a way to reduce the effects of natural hazards on vulnerable communities. Uh, so there are actually four priority areas as you can think of now. First, it says that priority one is you have to understand the disaster risk. Then, secondly, we have to strengthen the disaster risk governance to manage disaster risks. Thirdly, invest in disaster risk reductions for resilience. So, resilience is something that allows you to spring back after a disaster is gone. Then, fourth is enhancing our disaster preparedness for effective response and build back a better recovery, rehabilitation, and reconstruction. Okay. So in India also we have a Disaster Management Act. It is known as Disaster Management Act of 2005, which actually provides a robust policy framework for dealing with natural hazards. Okay, that is at at a country level. But since then, many states and union territories also have developed state disaster management plans, which is known as SDMPs. So together, these policies guide the actions of several institutions, including the Natural Disaster Management Authority (NDM), which is based in Delhi, the NITM, which is known as Natural Institute of Disaster Management, the Union Ministry of Home Affairs, the Disaster Management Authorities, and the District Disaster Management Authorities. So together, we have one framework. So let us go back to the cycle a little bit. We want to discuss this cycle. So as I said, that the moment the disaster strikes, this cycle actually comes into play. This is the modern disaster management concept. It has got four cycles or four approaches, as you can see it on the screen. The first one is known as the mitigation. So mitigation actually involves reduction or eliminating the likelihood. As you can see, whenever we talk about likelihood, we talk about the hazard, it's the other way around, or the consequences of a hazard, or both. So it actually seeks to treat the hazard that the impacts to the society are actually in a lesser degree. Okay, so if we talk about mitigation, we have to remember that it in a way tries to treat the hazard so that the impacts that it exerts on the society actually is to a lesser degree. So mitigation defines any sustained efforts also that someone can undertake to reduce the hazard risk, okay, through reduction of the likelihood or the consequence or the components of a hazard risk. So sometimes these mitigation steps are taken so that it somehow helps to reduce the hazard risk. Okay, so remember hazard, we talked about hazard, then it is the probability of occurrence. So we look into that component, the hazard component, whenever we look into the mitigation. And or in other words also mitigation seeks either to make a hazard less likely, you can say, or to occur or to reduce the negative impacts if it is to occur due to a hazard. Each hazard is unique, okay, in its effect on humans or the natural built environments. So likewise, each hazard has a unique set of mitigation options from which disaster managers may choose that have to develop or being conceived by remain to be developed. So each option actually carries an associated cost, a level of feasibility based upon several factors, and an expected success rate for actually reducing the hazard as it is designed. So we have to really think about what methods actually we are going to opt, if any. So this is the role of the disaster managers or someone who is actually working in the field of disaster management, which would be mostly dependent upon the range of other factors that includes amount of funds available, the anticipated social and physical consequences of such actions, and repetitiveness and geographic environment to which these measures will be applied. So for some mitigation measures, it also is defined by where you are situated, okay, and what may be the consequences of particular society if you adopt those kind of measures. So mitigation, if you look into this next slide here, for example, this you see that prevention and mitigation. And in terms of the mitigation, here this list shows the earthquake and then flood, and storm. So if sometimes if you were looking into retrofitting of vulnerable buildings, so sometimes if you have a building and then this building is getting old and then it has a likelihood that whenever there is a hazard that strikes, the building may collapse. So if you were doing some actions in order to retrofit the building, retrofit means in order to reinforce or stabilize the building, so that will come under a kind of mitigation measures. Okay, and then for similarly in case of a flood hazard, so if someone is constructing a dike or if you are building a dam or someone is actually reforestation taking the action of reforestation, or if we were taking as an overall basin-wide um, control of flood measurements, that all will be under this phase of mitigation. Basically, we are taking these actions in order to minimize the consequences of a hazard. Similarly, for cyclones or typhoons, so if you were sitting near to the sea or if you were living near to the sea, so if your country is taking a measure to construct a wall against the tides, that would be a mitigation measure. Okay. Sometimes establishment of forests. So what kind of forests? Sometimes if you have heard about the mangrove forests, so mangroves are very instrumental in in the reduction of these tidal effects as well as the cyclones. So they are the natural inhabitants sometimes which are found in the coastal areas. So if you are taking an initiative to regrow mangroves in areas where it is most prone to the cyclone or tidal hazards, that will come under one of these mitigation measures. Okay, but that will be actually area specific. So mangroves, they need the salinity of the sea water in order to grow, so that is easy for the coastal areas to maintain and then take such measures. But here we still are investigating the possibility if somehow mangroves can be grown and then it can be adopted as a mitigation measure against the kind of erosion or flood uh, in a situation like here in Assam. So for landslides, some of the mitigation measures may be construction of erosion control dams. Do you know how it can be helpful? So actually, this is a part of civil engineering: construction of erosion control dams and construction of retaining walls. So retaining walls, I'm not sure if you have seen a retaining wall. If you noticed it on the way to our university, the moment you take this right turn at the railway crossing, before the railway crossing, so on the right hand side you will notice a wall which is being constructed in order to prevent the landslide. That is kind of a retaining wall. It is known as retaining wall. So these all are actually a part of mitigation measures which are taken. So this is actually taken even before the disaster strikes. So then after the moment the disaster strikes, we have the response. But before that, we have another phase known as preparedness. Okay? So preparedness involves sometimes if you're equipping people who may be impacted by a disaster or who may be able to help those impacts or impacted with the tools to increase their chance of survival and to minimize their financial and other losses. Okay? The, Actually, the goal of disaster preparedness are known what to do in the disaster's aftermath. That means when the disasters are gone, then if you teach someone the know-how uh, how to survive it. So that can be a kind of disasters or preparedness uh, goal, you can say. So in that case, they know how to do it and then being equipped with the right tools to do it effectively. So this is a difficult process, and it may take years actually before attaining a satisfactory level and maintaining such a level is an ongoing effort. So it is not that the disaster is gone, your level of preparedness just drops. So it has to be a continuous effort. So normally what happens is preparedness minimizes the hazard's adverse effects through effective precautionary measures. So these measures are taken before the disaster actually strikes, and that ensures a timely, appropriate, and efficient organization and delivery of responsible relief action. So if you have a good preparedness action, that means these things becomes easy. So what are these things? Delivery of response and relief action. So an effective preparedness helps in delivering these things quite efficiently. So responding to any disaster, especially sometimes when a disaster is catastrophic, it is guaranteed to be unique, complex, and confusing most of the times. So preparedness actions and activities can divide according to the level or the catastrophic level of these disasters. Sometimes mostly the governments are also involved in this preparedness process. This includes the administration, the emergency management groups, the public health, and other service agencies. They work in one group, and the individuals and businesses are also that can come in the second group. So preparedness of the first group is normally defined and conducted through the creation and application of emergency management plans, which is known as EOP. Okay, and actually this is, I would say, fueled or trained by repeated exercises, which is normally taken from time to time. Uh, then, after preparedness, we have another step which is known as response. Hmm. It involves taking action actually to reduce the eliminate the impacts of disaster. That means whenever the disaster strikes, our work or this phase, the work starts. So it involves taking action to reduce or eliminate the impacts of a disaster that have occurred or are currently occurring. So the moment the hazard strikes and it has got negative consequences, then phase number three or response starts immediately. Okay. Uh, Sometimes the response it can come in order to prevent further suffering or financial loss or both combination of both. Also, it is known as a relief in term. It is commonly used in international disaster management. It is one of the response actually. So relief may come in form of aids, such as food, clothing, or medicines, and those kind of things. Okay, the response function of emergency management. This includes actions aimed at limiting the injuries or loss of lives and damage in properties and to the environment that are taken prior to, during, or immediately after a hazard event. A response actually begins as soon as it becomes apparent that a hazard event is imminent and it lasts until the emergency is declared to be over. So please pay attention to this statement that the moment disaster strikes, response starts, and it goes on until the country or the state declares the emergency to be over. Okay? Response is actually by far it is one of the most complex of the four functions of this emergency management. Uh, why it is called most of the complex? Since it is conducted during the periods of high stress, whenever the situation is very tense, there is an earthquake, people are getting buried by the debris, and then you have very less time to really respond or to react or to supply or relieve. Okay, so it may the effective time it's said that during an earthquake is actually 72 hours. So after 72 hours, the chances that you will actually find someone really alive within the rubbles really drops drastically. So that is one of the reasons it is very high stress time and highly time constrained environment with limited information. Again, we don't have really too much of an information when it comes really for a response. Okay, sometimes if you have unnecessary delay or you don't have really communication among the departments, actually that may translate directly to a really increase in tragedy and then huge increase in the destruction by the hazard. Okay. Remember at the same time that the response it not only includes only activities that are directly addresses the immediate needs, such as the first aids, search and rescue and shelter, but also it includes systems which can be developed uh, that may be developed earlier prior to the disaster in order to coordinate and support such efforts. Okay, so you may have a team which you are actually building up. So that also it says in order to respond during a time of disaster, so it will come under directly the kind of response activities. Okay, uh, one of the very crucial duties of response also is to really revive or resume the critical infrastructure activities, such as once during the floods or during the earthquakes, if you have some of the transportation routes which are damaged, you have some of the bridges which are actually gone. So the response objective is how quickly you can just go for the resumption of these critical infrastructures, such as roads or building bridges. Okay, mostly some communications networks, electricity. Sometimes electricity is often gone, and then it is under response that it is being restored so quick. And also you have to ensure that food and clean water actually is being distributed to the population. That is also a part of the response. So part of the response actually helps in the recovery. So that is a part of the response also to take place and reduce further injury and loss of life. So you have to make sure that whatever damage has happened. So we have to limit the damage up till here, and then we don't allow this to further happen. So this is also a part or objective of the response, and as quickly as possible bring the things to normal and then function the society back normally. Okay? So after that, the last one is known as the recovery. This is the fourth phase. Uh, as the word goes, you know that it involves returning the victim's life back to normal. How we can do it? So you have to follow the impacts of a disaster consequences. That recovery phase it begins after the immediate response has ended. So after point number three ends or phase number three ends, we can say that recovery has started. And it can go actually a process for months and years after that. So you don't have really an end into the recovery process. Not the direct measurement how you can say that this is the end of the recovery process. It can be a sustained effort and it can go for months and years after the response is being over. Disaster recovery is also part of emergency management. Um, So if you talk about the countries, communities, families, individuals, they can go for repair, reconstruct, or regain what has been lost as a result of disaster, and reduce the risk of similar catastrophic disasters in future. Okay, so in a comprehensive emergency management system, which includes pre-disaster planning, mitigation, and preparedness actions, recovery action may begin as early as during the planning process and activities long before a disaster occurs. So, once a disaster strikes, planned and unplanned recovery actions are immediately implemented, and it may extend for weeks and months or for years. At the same time, you will notice that the actions which are actually associated with disaster recovery are kind of one of the most diverse. of all the disaster management functions. The range of individuals which are involved are kind of diverse. Organizations, there are a lot of organizations which may come in order for recovery and other rehabilitation actions, and groups that are actually involved is also greater than any other functions. Okay. Um, so if I again go back to this slide here, there are a few of the definitions where you can see with the examples. So in terms of preparedness, okay, so construction and operation of a meteorological observation system. So what it happens is, once you have an operation of meteorological system, that means your meteorological system can tell you about how much of a rainfall that may happen in a particular basin or in a particular area, and that actually will help you take efficient measurements in order to prepare whether you are going to open the gates of a dike or how much of the water that you are going to retain at a particular reservoir, in case that you think that the reservoir may burst due to the exaggerate pressure. So uh, if you know that thing in advance, okay, or a way to know that thing in advance is by observing the meteorological system. So that can be one of the examples of your preparedness actions. Okay, that can be a preparedness actions in case of a flood hazard or flood disaster. Similar things, actually, we can give an example during the earthquake also. Sometimes there may be some observation systems which may be helpful in just pinpointing, or uh, how to say, you cannot really predict an earthquake, but at least you can uh, just narrow down the likelihood of its occurrence. So some of these operations or the constructions and operations of these observation systems can come under the preparedness phase during an earthquake hazard or an earthquake disaster, whatever you can say. For storms and cyclones, again, well, we can have this meteorological observation systems, which will be helpful again. So the data from these meteorological stations can go up to into a model which can predict the movement of these cyclones or typhoons or hurricanes. So these will be all coming under the preparedness phase. Okay. So apart from that, sometimes you can prepare some of the hazard maps. So remember in the first lecture I showed you a map of Assam where in the red areas it was highlighted where the flood was maximum. So these are known as the hazard maps. So these maps are a part of the preparedness phase. These maps can be made manually, or even these maps can be made with the help of a computer nowadays. Okay. If you are preparing or stockpiling food and material or emergency drills someone is doing or undertaking in order to raise the awareness, everything will come under the preparedness phase. So one of the very important phases of preparedness is also the establishing an early warning system. So early warning systems can tell you in advance when the disaster is going to strike. Can you think of an early warning system in case of flood? Do we have an early warning system? Do we or not? Early warning systems are at place in case of floods. So I don't know if you have known about these gauge stations which are situated along the rivers. So one of the duties of these gauge stations is to measure how much of the water is there at a particular time of the day. This is normally taken by the Water Resource Department in Assam. So what they do, they go to the river and then they try to measure the depth of water at a particular point of time in a day, and then normally it is taken three times a day. So if you see that the water level is gradually rising and then it is crossing a certain threshold, so depending on the threshold, they can issue warnings. Okay, this is a part of an early warning system, greater early warning system. So if you are establishing such a gauge station or an instrument which can predict such kind of a flood activity that may happen in future, and this would be coming under the construction or preparedness phase. particularly in the event of a flood. Someone is actually preparing an emergency kits, so you know that there is going to be floods, then you are arranging for food, you are arranging for electricity batteries, then you are arranging for survival items, and then you are just you just keeping it in the case that there will be floods, and then the moment it strikes, you are going to distribute these emergency kits to the victims. So that also will come under the phase of preparedness. Okay. So remember, these two phases are actually even taken before the disaster strikes. So the moment the disaster strikes, we have the response phase. Okay. So response includes the rescue efforts, whatever is taken if someone is buried under the earthquake rubble. So if you are taking help of rescue dogs, if you are taking help of heavy machinery in order to reduce or just rearrange or dig through the rubbles, this should be a part of response. First aid treatment. So you are finding some of the victims which are actually not having too much of a casualty. If you are treating those victims on the spot, okay, with the first aid, whatever is there, it will be your response. Then firefighting. So one of the secondary disasters or hazards after earthquake is the fire, as I said earlier. So if you're directly dealing this fire, if you're trying to extinguish the fire somehow or the other, that would be one of your responses. Okay, monitoring for secondary disasters. As I said, there may be a disaster of fire, there may be a disaster of electrification. So that these things do not happen, you are making sure that these things are not happening. This would be a part of your response. Sometimes what happens during urban flooding, we often hear in the news that people uh, who try to walk through the waters sometimes are more killed, not because by drowning but by electrocution, so that there are live wires which are under the water. So normally we should not be walking in the situation like that. So you are making sure that these secondary disasters do not occur. It also will be a part of the response. Construction of temporary housing. So if you're building temporary houses in order for temporary shelter people during the time of a disaster, that will be also a response. So often we see that whenever there is a flood, people often take shelter in the high or elevated areas. So in order for these people to stay those days without diseases or without much complications, we normally build some of these temporary houses. So that would be a part of your response. Okay. And actually these things you have to rethink and then try to connect to the actions that you see in and around you, so that you can just make a clear distinction of these actions, either it is rehabilitation or preparedness or prevention or mitigation actions. So in rehabilitation, you see that it is a long-term process, as it says, and it is one of the very diverse processes. So, for examples, it can be a disaster resistance reconstruction. Uh, so, if I want to give you an example, so after the tsunami is gone, people lost a lot of their houses which were in the coastal areas, and most of them were actually fishermen. So, what the government of India did in the coastal areas, they tried to build the houses for these people, and these houses were built far away from the coastal areas. So, this was actually an example of a failure of a rehabilitation or reconstruction effort. So, when these people they found their new houses, they were not very willing to go to these houses. Only why? Because they have lost their livelihood, because they cannot leave the sea at the same time. From the sea, they are earning their livelihood. So if you build a house that is far away from the sea, then normally not everyone is willing to go and then stay there for a long time. So you have to be very careful in the reconstruction effort. Is that effort that you are undertaking is culturally or socially viable for the people who we were targeting? So if you are constructing houses, which are really the kind of houses these people are not familiar, probably they will not be willing to stay in those houses. So if these houses are built far away from the areas in order so that they have to leave their livelihoods, which has been undertaken for several generations, so the people were not going to really take whatever you were throwing them at. So reconstruction and rehabilitation has to be a long-term effect. So there should be some sensible people who should be uh, taking up this effort and taking into consideration the victims' cultural and social needs at the same time. Okay. So in the long-term example, maybe one of the livelihood supports, if you were helping people to just come out of the cycle of poverty, that can be one of the examples of a reconstruction or rehabilitation effort. So, can you think of one of the livelihood support actions when people are losing our uh, are you aware of any livelihood supports undertaken by any of the NGOs? How about people from social work? Can you give me an example?
Could you please
Livelihood
repeat the
support,
question?
yes. Hmm. I heard someone speaking. Who's this?
Prati,
I cannot hear. Who is this? Pratiti. Okay. Pratiti. Can you give me an example where some of the NGOs or even the government is actually trying to uplift people out of the poverty cycle? In a way, they are helping their livelihood. Just in case of the situation of Assam, and then if you can take about a normal situation or during a disaster or after disaster. So, do you have any example that you can tell?
so the afternoon lunch that is given in schools, government schools.
Yes, yes. Uh, I somehow I really didn't get across what you were saying because my speaker is not very good these days. I cannot really
So
hear.
the meal. So the meal that is given in government schools.
Schools, yes. Can you write down
Yes.
if in,
So
in
the
two words if you can in the chat box so that I can just read it and then try to make
okay,
what you were trying to say because I cannot really hear. Yes, in the chat box so that everyone can see. This is for everyone, okay? The think of a livelihood support system. Actually, this is where civil engineers as well as people from communications or social workers, everyone's part of share in the rehabilitation and reconstruction process, as told earlier. So, as civil engineers, we have a duty to build a low-cost housings which can be culturally viable, as I said before, so that you don't have to really go far away. You can build houses with locally available materials. What a strategy that you can adopt. Okay, and livelihood support. There may be some of the examples. Okay, meal given in government schools, students known as midday meal scheme. Okay. Okay. I'd like to come back and have a bigger discussion in this issue. Probably you will be able to tell us in detail how that can help in the livelihood support. Yes, that can be an example. And yes, so if someone is from Dhemaji and then Lakhimpur and then those areas, you will see that many of these cultivating lands which are being actually dumped by sand, or it is known as sand casting, people have lost their lives, and then a new livelihood support scheme is there through MG Narega or MG Narega mostly is that you can grow some strawberry or other kind of uh, cultivation in those areas which are favorable in sand casted areas. So you have to help people how they can do that kind of a thing. So that is a kind of support activity you can undertake or someone can undertake. Then another one is maybe industrial rehabilitation planning, but actually these are not the exclusive list. The list can you can add it into the list, and just you have to think what can be your or what how you think you can contribute to the rehabilitation or reconstruction. Okay. Our meeting will end probably in 5 or 3 minutes. So today we'll have not much of a time to discuss further things. So again, I come back to the mitigation measures. So mitigations are basically of two types. One is known as structural, and another one is non-structural mitigation. So if time permits, tomorrow probably we can just discuss a little bit in detail about these two types of mitigation measures. Structural mitigation measures are employed to achieve the first two goals listed, like the reduction in the likelihood or the consequence of a hazard. So, if you can somehow fight the hazard directly or just minimize the likelihood that the hazard, uh, the probability of its occurrence may reduce. In that case, you were taking or undertaking a structural mitigation measure. Um, Anyway, tomorrow we will have a time to discuss this thing in detail. So, examples maybe whenever you are trying to, in this slide again, you see these are the examples of structural mitigation measures. Building a dam or construction of a dike. So, what they do, they try to divert the water directly. Or building of a dam, what they do, they try to retain the water so that the flood in the lower stream is the effect of flood or the impact of flood is reduced, or they just control the release of water through them. In that case, these are all structural mitigation measures. So you do it through some hard way or hard structural measures. So sometimes you can achieve it or try to achieve it through non-structural measures. So in that case, we can say that these are the non-structural mitigations. Okay, so maybe another one lecture. Then in that case, we can finish this module number one, and then, as I said, module number two was just an example of different kinds of natural hazards. So mostly we'll cover module number one and two, and then after one class or from the next week, we can just jump into our module number three. That will be our basic concepts of remote sensing. Okay. And then in between, I said I may take a certain test, which will be mostly of MCQs, just in order to test how far actually we are together on board, going in the same direction. Okay. Okay then. Oh, I just forgot to share you the link where you have to uh, give your attendance. If I may, just a moment.